I want to bring in Mark Thompson, a beat guest and the host of the Make It Plain podcast. He is actually aboard the Freedom Ride bus organized by Black Voters Matter, campaigning for voting rights. Thank you for joining us. What are you fighting for?
Well, we have been going to a number of cities: New Orleans, Jackson, Mississippi, Birmingham, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee. Right now, we're in Columbia, South Carolina. We'll be in Raleigh, North Carolina tomorrow. But as we go Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., we're going from city to city, engaging voters who are very concerned about all of these new voter suppression laws.
Let me, I'm interrupting. Let's listen in.
Please, of course.
Affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam President.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Madam President, I want to be clear about what just happened on the Senate floor. Every single Senate Republican just voted against starting debate on legislation to protect Americans' voting rights. Once again, the Senate Republican minority has launched a partisan blockade of a pressing issue here in the United States Senate, an issue no less fundamental than the right to vote. Could we have order, Madam President?
The Senate will be in order.
I've laid out the facts for weeks. Republican state legislatures across the country are engaged in the most sweeping voter suppression in 80 years, capitalizing on and catalyzed by Donald Trump's big lie. These state governments are making it harder for younger, poorer, urban, and non-white Americans to vote. Earlier today, the Republican leader told reporters that, quote, regardless of what may be happening in some states, there's no rationale for federal intervention. The Republican leader flatly stated that no matter what the states do to undermine our democracy, voter suppression laws, phony audits, partisan takeovers of local election boards, the Senate should not act. My colleagues, if senators 60 years ago held that the federal government should never intervene to protect voting rights, this body would have never passed the Voting Rights Act. The Republican leader uses the language and the logic of the Southern senators in the 60s who defended states' rights, and it is an indefensible position for any senator, let alone the minority leader, to hold. And yet that was the reason given for why Republicans voted in lockstep today. Regardless of what may be happening in some states, there's no rationale for federal intervention. That is both ridiculous and awful. All we wanted to do here on the floor was to bring up the issue of voting rights and debate how to combat these vicious, oftentimes discriminatory voting restrictions. And today, every single Democratic senator stood together in the fight to protect the right to vote in America. The Democratic Party in the Senate will always stand united to defend our democracy. I spoke with President Biden earlier this afternoon as well. He has been unshakable in his support of S1, and I want to thank the President and the Vice President for their efforts. But regrettably, our efforts were met by the unanimous opposition of the Senate minority. Once again, Senate Republicans have signed their names in the ledger of history alongside Donald Trump, the big lie, and voter suppression, to their enduring disgrace. This vote, I'm ashamed to say, is further evidence that voter suppression has become part of the official platform of the Republican Party. Now, Republican senators may have prevented us from having a debate on voting rights today, but I want to be very clear about one thing. The fight to protect voting rights is not over, by no means. In the fight for voting rights, this vote was the starting gun, not the finish line. Let me say that again. In the fight for voting rights, this vote was the starting gun, not the finish line. As many have noted, including my friend, Senator Warnock, this morning, when John Lewis was about to cross that bridge in Selma, He didn't know what waited for him on the other side. He didn't know how long his march would be. And his ultimate success was never guaranteed. But he started down that bridge anyway. Today, Democrats started our march to defend the voting rights of all Americans. It could be a long march, but it's one we are going to make. Today, we made progress. For the first time in this Congress, we got all 50 Democrats unified behind moving forward on a strong and comprehensive voting rights bill. And make no mistake about it, it will not be the last time that voting rights comes up for a debate in the Senate. Republicans may want to avoid the topic, hoping that their party's efforts to suppress votes and defend the big lie will go unnoticed. Democrats will not allow that. Democrats will never let this voter suppression be swept under the rug. We have several serious options for how to reconsider this issue and advance legislation to combat voter suppression. We are going to explore every last one of our options. We have to. Voting rights are too important, too fundamental. This concerns the very core of our democracy and what we are about as a nation. So we will not let it go. We will not let it die. This voter suppression cannot stand, and we are going to work tirelessly to see that it does not stand. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
We have been listening there to Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer giving an impassioned speech. The Senate splitting there on this procedural vote on the voting rights bill, 50-50. Vice President Harris presiding over the important vote. We can see her chatting there still up at the lectern. We are told to expect remarks from the Vice President, which is also fairly unusual for any day of Senate business, and so we will bring those to you live here on MSNBC as they occur. 6:28 p.m. here on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., and you can see the Senate floor starting to filter out. This was the expected outcome, but it is now official. This is a GOP filibuster. Republicans using this mechanism, the cloture vote, the procedural vote, to formally filibuster and block any floor consideration of the voting rights and election reform bill. There you have it. And what we just heard from Senator Schumer was what was expected, but it was quite impassioned. The majority leader making the argument that this vote today is meaningful, even though it's not the outcome the Democrats wanted, because they wanted progress. But he says they've nonetheless had some measured steps here. Number one, Senator Schumer emphasizing that they did get all 50 votes for this step, including Manchin. Number two, he says that this vote shows that the National Republican Party, not just the state crackdowns that we've reported on, the National Republican Party, through this vote, is signing up that voter suppression is part of their platform. We're going to keep an eye on the floor where you see other senators now coming up to speak. We will bring you, as mentioned, the Vice President's remarks, if, as expected, she makes them. I want to bring our panel back in, starting with Che. Well, let me do this. Let me start with Mark, who I'm realizing as a point of order I had to depart from, and then go to Che and the rest of the panel on reaction to Senator Schumer. But Mark, I will ask you to hold your other comments in the chamber, rhetorically, so to speak, and first give us your reaction to what we just heard and this breaking news from Senator Schumer.
Well, I think Senator Schumer was accurate in everything he said, and he called out the Republican Party for what it is. Democrats, 50 Democrats represent 43 million more people than the 50 Republicans do. And this is a holdover from really the time of enslavement. Many of these senators represent places that don't have the same population, while the majority of people support this legislation. So this is not a democracy. This is a minority that is controlling this. And, you know, at the risk of making a controversial metaphor, I mean, we know what minority rule is. And there's a term for minority rule, and that's called apartheid. We fought against that as well. This is history made tonight, Ari, on your show. A minority of Americans, representing a minority of Americans, is doing all it can to prevent democracy and from the majority of people in this country voting, and we've got to do something about that. That's why we're in these streets. I totally agree with Senator Schumer. Something's going to have to be done. We just have got to keep organizing and mobilizing, and people are going to have to continue to fight for their voting rights so we can have some semblance of democracy in America with what they're trying to take away.
Let me take it quickly to Che and then Mara, and we are now getting advised the Vice President will be coming out shortly, and we'll go right to that, as always, for the news when it happens. But briefly, Che, what argument did Senator Schumer make there in your view?
Yeah, I mean, he made the right argument, but and he basically said so much for bipartisanship. You know, there has been nothing but an outstretched hand on the part of the Democrats. Joe Manchin has offered compromise solutions, taking out the voter ID provision, still allowing Republican legislatures or Republican secretaries of state to purge voter rolls. I mean, these are tremendous concessions. There's been an outstretched hand, and I think what Senator Schumer was really trying to say is all they've been met with on the Republican side is a closed fist.
And let's listen into the Vice President.
The United States Congress could take up, which is about the fundamental right to vote in our country. And I think it is clear, certainly, for the American people, that when we're talking about the right to vote, it is not a Republican concern or a Democratic concern. It is an American concern. This is about the American people's right to vote, unfettered. It is about their access to the right to vote in a meaningful way. Because nobody is debating, I don't believe, whether all Americans have the right to vote. The issue here is there actual access to the voting process, or is that being impeded? And the bottom line is that the President and I are very clear. We support S1. We support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and the fight is not over.
What's next? Which Republicans did you talk to tonight?
Vice President Harris speaking here after presiding over the Senate floor vote. She's walking there out of the chamber. I just want to underscore this is fairly unusual. The Vice President, of course, has the constitutional duty to oversee the Senate, although it's ceremonial, so we don't always see it in action. And when they do, they don't always come out and speak. I think we're seeing, and I want to go to Mara now with our panel, I think we're seeing just the level of coordination, of import that the Democratic Party with its current leadership is putting forward here. And, you know, I could say it or someone else could say it, but I think it's quite obvious and clear. We're also speaking about the first minority woman in the White House, president or vice president, in this role. And she is saying that in her positive way, she put it, she said she hopes no one's actually opposing the right to vote, and yet that's what today's action does, and trying to conjoin with her former colleague, Senator Schumer, Mara, who's arguing that this is a revelatory moment for the modern Republican Party, for any Americans who may have been watching but thinking, well, it's not this bad, or it's local, or it's not coordinated. Your response to what we just saw?
Yeah, it is unusual, Ari. The Democrats are sending a clear message, and specifically, I would say at this point, the White House is sending a clear message. It knows that this is an important issue, and the Vice President, Kamala Harris, is speaking directly, I believe as well, not just to Democratic voters, but to Black voters and others whose vote is directly under threat. We see you, we will fight for you, hang with us. I think that's really important, because there are people in the street putting their bodies and lives and safety on the line right now to protect the right of all Americans to vote, not just Black Americans. I think this is historic for actually a much darker reason today, and that's that we have not seen access to the ballot debated in this way and turned into this partisan issue since, in fact, the 1960s and 1970s. So if you're an American who grew up with parents who lived through Jim Crow, as I did, this is your history books, some of the darkest hours of your history books coming to life and reminding us that progress is not inevitable. And at every turn in this country, the filibuster has been used to stop the expansion of democracy and to prevent America from living up to its promise to allow all of its citizens full access to the ballot and to the rights and privileges of citizenship in this country. That's how the filibuster has always been used, or mostly been used, I should say. And it's very dark. And I actually don't believe that minority rule in this country would truly be sustainable if the majority in this country could take it seriously. The real question, I believe, for Democrats tonight is, what line do the Republicans cross where you say enough is enough? Do you have a line in the sand where you say, okay, it's time to kill the filibuster? And if not, what does that mean? If so, where is it? The American people want to know, because while we're debating this, these laws are being put into place, and there are going to be real Americans who are going to have a very difficult time voting not long from now. So the time to act is now.
And as you say, there's no solution there where people say, well, just get involved and go vote. No, we're covering tonight what's happening in the Senate about whether people will be able to freely and fairly exercise that right to vote or not, and whether this anti-democratic tool, this filibuster obstruction, will be used for anti-democratic ends to prevent people from voting. And those people, as is often the case in American history, are black and brown people. And some other people. We've seen voter ID discriminating in other ways, including against the elderly. But in the main and in the recent politics, we know what this is. Mark, we were speaking with you earlier. I'm going to ask my control room to just go full on your position, because Mara was just walking us through the stakes of this. And there you are on a Black Voters Matter bus. Out there doing this work around the country. Earlier in our coverage on MSNBC, we had footage from another such grassroots effort. There is this counter push, but the news tonight, my job to issue the news, whether people like it or not, is that the Republicans did exercise their obstruction under the current rules in the Senate. That's what happened. So the question now is whether people doing what you're doing on the Black Voters Matter bus, people putting pressure on individual senators, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden, how hands-on does Joe Biden want to get? We just saw his vice president make an impassioned statement in pressing the current incumbent Democratic senators to change something or not. So we go back to you on that thought.
Well, everybody on the panel, I think, has eloquently expressed what the issue is. And as a matter of fact, they voted this down, the Republicans did, precisely because of who was presiding. There is a fight against having diversity when it comes to elected officials, when it comes to people serving government. So you have a woman who is African American and Indian American and Jamaican American and a woman. She checks all the boxes. And they look up there at her and say, obviously, we want to make sure that this does not continue. The Republican Party still intends to continue to be the party, not even of poor and middle class whites, as Reverend Barber would say, but rather the party of privileged whites. LaTosha Brown and Cliff Albright founded Black Voters Matter. I am their guest on this bus. As we go from city to city, people are activated, motivated. Tomorrow, as I said, we'll be in Raleigh, North Carolina. We'll go to Richmond, Virginia as well. On Saturday, we invite all to join us on the National Mall. We will have a peaceful demonstration in front of the U.S. Capitol, and we will demand that this voter suppression end, and also lift up one of the oldest examples of voter suppression has been going on for a couple of centuries, and that's the lack of statehood for the District of Columbia. But I think that this is going to motivate even more people to get out and vote. And Shay said something important. Bipartisanship is there. First of all, y'all, why are Democrats like Manchin the only ones using bipartisanship? What Republicans have you seen even use the term? And when you don't see others invoking that terminology, it lets you know that it's not even real. Mara's right as well. This filibuster is an enslavement relic. It has got to go. You cannot have people's right to vote blocked in this way. So we've got a lot of work to do. We ask people to continue to remain organized, to remain vigilant, continue to fight. And this has to be challenged on all these state and local levels as well. Get involved. This is why, let me just say, it's important to run for offices that are down ballot, because you can affect change at the local level, whether it be on election boards or city councils, legislature. All of that is important. And again, we invite everyone to join us, if you can, in Washington, D.C. at high noon on the National Mall in front of the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah, and I expect we'll be checking in with you on the work you're doing, on how that goes, because this is a story that emanates out of the United States Senate. That's where the news was made tonight, and yet, as is so often the case in the quest for voting rights in America, one that has to be fortified around the nation. I want to thank all of our panelists, some of whom have already left us, some of whom you see on the screen on this historic night. Thank you very much.